All right, well, we're beginning a new series today on the supernatural. I want to just review the source material. I've been reading on this for a couple of years now, since it first came to my attention. The big book is called Unseen Realm. That's a very scholarly book by Dr. Michael Heiser. It's 42 chapters with heavily footnoted notes. Dr. Heiser always says that he is only a dot connector, that the material in the Unseen Realm isn't new to him. He's not breaking new ground at all. He's just bringing scholarly work forward and connecting the dots with where Christians have traditionally understood about the supernatural and filling in some gaps where those things are not part of most churches' traditional teaching. But scholars have been working with the ancient texts and with the context of the ancient Near East for decades. And so nothing is new in Unseen Realm, but it's just new to us. Now, he condensed that because it is heavily footnoted and very scholarly in its approach. Not as much as some. He's a good writer, so I think it's approachable even at his most scholarly. But he condensed that into a book called Supernatural, the book that I'm going to be providing you here. It's only 16 chapters. There are no footnotes. Everything is right there in the text as he describes it. And then one of the friends and associates of Dr. Heiser, a man named Dr. Ron Johnson, he took and created a study guide with only 8 chapters, basically taking it 2 chapters a week or per session from the Supernatural book. And I am referencing in my study and preparation for teaching all 3 of these books and looking at different aspects of them to bring them in together and using the guide of the study guide to condense 2 weeks or 2 chapters of Supernatural a week into one session. So it's an 8-week series that we are going to embark on today. And I have left 1 week at the end for questions. So we actually have 9 weeks of this study, but the last week will simply be Q&A. Supernatural as an idea isn't really new territory for Christians. There's a lot of familiar things that have to do with the supernatural in the Bible. What are some things that come to your mind? If someone says, what's supernatural in the Bible? What are some things that are familiar to Christians that are from the realm of supernatural?
Angels.
Angels, absolutely. Miracles, yeah. And demons, did you say? Yeah, the opposite of angels, right? Yep. You don't have angels without demons, it seems. They're like opposite. Although demons have gotten a lot more press recently. Like in the TV series Supernatural. Demons versus angels, I guess, and that, I think. But back when I was growing up, the angels were getting the headliners, like Touched by an Angel, what was Michael Landon's Angel? Highway to Heaven, exactly. And those kinds of things. The demons seem to be more exciting now, I guess. Yeah, there's a lot of familiar stuff. That supernatural is not unfamiliar territory for us. A lot of atheists or whatever would see these things as supernatural and try to dismiss them. But we Christians, we talk about them all the time. Of course, the big one, raising from the dead. Jesus rose from the dead, resurrection, and he raised others from the dead during his ministry. And that appears in the Old Testament too. So there's a lot of familiar territory. But there is also, even with all this relative familiarity with supernatural and willingness to accept the supernatural as a regular part of our belief system, there are still some passages in the Bible that can be a little weird. What are some passages in the Bible that strike you as just weird, especially weird with regard to the supernatural?
I think with Elijah went back to heaven with the chariot.
All right, Elijah and the chariots of fire.
Yeah.
Instead of dying, he's taken in a chariot, and Elisha takes his place after that. Yeah.
I think in a general sense, pretty much the entire book of Revelation.
Book of Revelation, yes. That can strike one as weird at times, for sure. I'm not sure I'm going to unweird that. don't think anybody could.
Saul discussing with Samuel after Samuel's passing.
Okay? Yes. The witch at Endor. I love that because it's a planet in Star Wars, or at least a moon. Yeah, Endor. But yeah, that whole scene, and I'm actually going to reference that today. There are lots of passages, just individual stories that kind of stand out as just odd, and they hardly ever get talked about either in a class and especially in a sermon. How was the last time that you heard a sermon that centered at all around Saul and the witch at Endor and Samuel, or the book of Revelation? That even lessons on that are kind of few and far between. And one thing that came up in the Living Waters class, when I was teaching Living Waters before we merged with Salt and Light, and I was privileged to teach in this class, I was teaching Living Waters. We were going through that same series on going through the Bible book by book, and we were starting Genesis, very beginning of the historical book series. And John Savage was very excited about starting that series because he had a particular question about one particular passage that he wanted to hear my take on as we were studying through it, and it had to do with a group of people called the Nephilim, or Nephilim. It's not like I had never heard of them before John asked about them, but I didn't have a good answer for his question about what they were exactly, where they came from. I had read material about them. And just in case you haven't heard of the Nephilim or aren't familiar with that, let's read the passage. It's from Genesis chapter 6, first 4 verses. When people began being numerous on the earth, and daughters had been born to them, the sons of God, looking at the women, saw how beautiful they were, and married as many of them as they chose. Yahweh said, "My spirit cannot be indefinitely responsible for human beings who are only flesh. Let the time allowed each be 120 years. The Nephilim were on earth in those days, and even afterwards, when the sons of God resorted to the women and had children by them. These were the heroes of days gone by, the men of renown." That's one of those weird passages. Who are these sons of God? There are different theories. I read up on them and tried to give John a coherent solution, but at the time I really struggled to do that because I hadn't really gotten a grasp on it. I hadn't started listening to Dr. Heiser or reading his books. And so I didn't have a context for really understanding this passage. And the explanations that I read didn't really seem to match exactly everything in the passage. I had also taught a series on the book of Jude in one of those Wednesday night Bible study classes. I did, I think, 8 weeks on the book of Jude, which if you're familiar with Jude, it's the shortest book in the New Testament. It's 1 page long. So 8 weeks may seem like a stretch for that little book, but it really wasn't. And I realized while I was teaching through there that there were connections between the book of Jude and another book that is not in our Bible called 1 Enoch. And there is one quotation about Jesus coming with the 10,000s of angels. And the only other place you find a reference of the Messiah returning with 10,000 angels is in 1 Enoch. So I had made a connection between Enoch and Jude with regard to this phrase of Jesus coming with 10,000 angels. But what I didn't realize is that this other verse here, Jude verse 6, Jude doesn't get a chapter designation after all because it's only 1 chapter long. So Jude verse 6, "And the angels who did not keep to the authority they had but left their appointed sphere, he has kept in darkness in eternal bonds until the judgment of the great day." The angels in bonds, what about their appointed sphere? Who are these guys? Another odd question. And what is fascinating is that, as I understand it now, this verse actually connects to the verse in Genesis. So Jude 6 and Genesis 6 actually overlap. But be that as it may, we will get to that more a little bit next week. But what I didn't appreciate is that for Jude and for this verse, practically the entire book of 1 Enoch is about these angels that are kept in eternal darkness. I hadn't really made that connection at the time. I had just found that one phrase and saw that it was connected. But basically all of 1 Enoch is about these particular angels, and so Jude is pulling from that here too. I didn't know that. And there's one other odd phrase that often gets passed by. It's in 1 Kings chapter 22. Now in 1 Kings chapter 22, to set some context up, Ahab, the evil king of the north of Israel, is thinking about attacking an enemy at a place called Ramoth Gilead. He's not certain he can win, so he actually gets the southern king of Judah to ally with him so that they can go up against this enemy. And as probably was his normal routine, he calls in prophets to give him an idea of how this battle is going to go, or any advice the prophets might give on how to attack it. Now, I use the word prophets a little bit loosely because as a northern king, he was highly influenced by the Canaanite religion. Only a few of these prophets as a group were actually loyal to Yahweh or claimed to be speaking for Yahweh. They were a mix of prophets of Baal, prophets of Yahweh, supposedly prophets of this or that god. And so he's getting all of their input. And probably because the king of Judah is with him and he is a loyalist to Yahweh, he makes the unusual decision to get the advice of one Micaiah. Now, Micaiah was known to be exclusively loyal to Yahweh. He was known as a true prophet of Yahweh, and he almost always said negative things about Ahab, as one might expect. And so Ahab normally didn't ask Micaiah for advice, but this time he makes the exception and calls him in. And Micaiah says this to him in 1 Kings chapter 22, verses 19 through 23. Micaiah went on, "Now listen to the word of Yahweh. I saw Yahweh sitting on his throne, with the whole array of heaven standing by him, on his right and on his left. Yahweh said, 'Who will entice Ahab into marching to his death at Ramoth in Gilead?' At which some answered one way, some another. A spirit then came forward and stood before Yahweh and said, 'I will entice him.' 'How?' Yahweh asked. And he replied, 'I shall go and be a deceptive spirit in the mouths of all his prophets.' Yahweh said, 'You'll succeed in enticing him. Go and do it.' And now you see, Yahweh has put a deceptive spirit into the mouths of all your prophets here. For in fact, Yahweh has pronounced disaster on you." I should have said before that, all of those prophets had said Ahab would win the battle, by the way. So this is exactly, all the prophets, all of them, the prophets of Baal, the supposed prophets of Yahweh, the supposed prophets from all these different gods, all said, yes, you'll win the battle. Except Micaiah, who comes up and says this. They're all just speaking to you with a deceptive spirit that was sent by Yahweh, and he describes how that happens here. That if it's ever been taught on, they probably would teach it like a parable. Like that Micaiah is just telling a fictional story about a hypothetical situation where God sets up the prophets to lie, and Micaiah is going to tell the truth. But I don't believe that. Not now. I probably would have believed that before I did a study of how the supernatural realm kind of works in different passages. Because in isolation, you can kind of take each one of them and just treat them as a one-off sort of situation. But when you see that this is a pattern in different places, it becomes apparent this is not just a hypothetical, fictional parable that Micaiah is telling here. This is, in fact, how God runs the unseen realm. He has a group of divine beings around him. I'm going to use the word divine. I do not mean that they are all equal to Yahweh. Yahweh is unique. He is the uncreated creator of everything else. But there are beings in the heavenly realm with him. We would typically call them angels, I think, if we were just going to use a common term. And I'll use the word angels until a little bit later in the lesson when I have a different term that I'm going to propose. But angels is what we might think about them. So here's God with angels around him. And God actually involves these angels in his governance of how things work in this world. He engages with them. He tells them that he has a plan or an outcome that he is seeking, and then he engages with these angels right here to how that might actually play out. And he gives them choice. He gives them free will so that these angels can make choices of their own and debate them even. One says this, one says that. They discuss amongst themselves how might be the best way to get Ahab to Ramoth-Gilead so that he can be killed. And then this one puts himself forward and suggests it. This happens often enough, and that there's actually a term for it. It's called the divine counsel. God works in conjunction with these angelic beings to govern the unseen and seen realms. And this divine counsel works rather like we just saw. So Micaiah's parable there, if you will, that description turns out to be a very literal description of how things unfold. And once you understand this, once you get this idea, it crops up over and over again in different contexts in the Old Testament. This is an illustration of the divine counsel from thebibleproject.com. I am a fan of thebibleproject.com as much as I'm a fan of Dr. Heiser. And so you can see this video all about the divine counsel at bibleproject.com or on YouTube if you search for the Bible Project. I like how they illustrate the divine beings. They're basically people with elongated limbs and things growing out of their heads. I don't know. And they never depict Yahweh God. They depict his throne with a kind of luminous presence at the throne. So that is representing God there in the center of this illustration. And then the divine beings around, and they're in fact discussing Ahab, which is what you see in the little pool, or in the hole in the middle. They're discussing Ahab and how they're going to get him to go to Ramoth-Gilead. So this is a common thing. And in fact, we find divine counsel, that phrase, one way to translate Hebrew for a council or grouping of angels. And Psalm 82 is one of these places in Scripture where the divine counsel is itself kind of front and center of the discussion. And we're going to look at Psalm 82 in some detail. It's at one point, not today. I just want to go to the first verse of Psalm 82. God takes his stand in the divine assembly. Surrounded by the gods, he gives judgment. So, divine assembly, that's the phrase here. One way to translate divine counsel. It could have been translated divine counsel if that's what the translators had chosen. It's just a group of beings that God sits in the middle of. Now, the first word in this sentence in Hebrew is Elohim, translated as God. If you've been a Christian for very long and you have gone into any kind of Bible study that digs into the original languages, and you know the word Elohim. It's translated as God, meaning Yahweh God, the God of Israel, several hundred times. So it is the most common word for God in the God of Israel, and it's the first word in this sentence. But it actually comes up again when it says surrounded by the gods, plural, lowercase g. That's also the word Elohim, the exact same word. Elohim takes his stand in the divine assembly, surrounded by the Elohim. He gives judgment. Now, Elohim itself, as a word, is plural. It looks plural. That I am at the end, Elohim, H-I-M at the end. That I am ending is a plural ending, in like adding an S to a noun in English. So it looks plural. But it doesn't take plural verbs all the time. Like takes his stand, that's a singular. So it's impossible to say the gods or gods take their stand. That's not what the verse says. It clearly is singular. God takes his stand. One God, one stand, his. And when the grammar demands singularity, then Elohim is translated as God. One God, and it means the God of Israel. But when the context shows that we're talking about more than one, or the verb shows that there's more than one, then it's translated as gods, lowercase g, like the gods of the nations, the Baal, Molech, the other gods of these other nations. It refers to the bigger group. But it turns out that Elohim is used in some different ways. It doesn't just mean the one God of Israel, and it doesn't just mean these gods of the nations. It also is used to mean things like demons. Demons are also referred to as Elohim in one particular passage, Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 17. It says they sacrifice to demons. That's a word in Hebrew called shadim. They sacrifice to these demons who are not God, to gods, that's Elohim, hitherto unknown to them, to newcomers of yesterday whom their ancestors had never respected. So these shadim, demons, are also Elohim. They're these powers of the supernatural. And it is actually also used in a very surprising way. At least one time, it's used of a human spirit. It's in 1 Samuel 28, verse 13. The king, that Saul, he's at the witch of Endor, that whole thing we talked about earlier. The king Saul is with the witch of Endor, and the king asks the witch why she's so afraid. The king said, "Don't be afraid, what do you see?" And the woman said to Saul, "I see a ghost rising from the earth." Now it's not obvious because the translators chose none of the normal words for translating Elohim, but the word ghost here is Elohim. I see an Elohim rising from the earth. In some translations they do actually say, I see a God rising from the earth. That Elohim is Samuel, coming back to have the dialogue with Saul. So Elohim refers to God, the one true God of Israel. It refers to the gods of the nations around Israel. It refers to the demons, and it refers to the spirit of Samuel. How can one word be all of these, applicable to all of these things? Now here's an illustration, again, from a different Bible Project video, one dedicated to the term Elohim. And the point is that the word doesn't designate one particular person. It describes a kind of entity. And the kind of entity it describes is the kind that is at home in the unseen realm. A spiritual being. A being that is not of our world, but a power of the other world. And the spirits of even humans, the spirits, once we die, are a natural part of the unseen realm, not a part of our realm, normally. So Elohim can apply to all of them. One interesting metaphor I just sort of briefly heard from the Bible Project people, Tim Mackey particularly, was that it's like the word mom. Mom has the same kind of variation to it. Because if I just said, Melanie's a mom, that would describe something about her that we would all know. She has a child. That's a relational thing. But if I said, my mom is going to come to class, then that's one particular person. But she's still a mom. She still has that relationship, but I'm designating one particular. And then if I call her on the phone and I say, Mom, I'm using that as a name. The word mom is like a name of her name for me. Like our children's name for Susan is Mom. And it's kind of jarring when we don't call her that, when they don't call her that. If they were to call her Susan, it would be odd. They call her mom because that's her name. And just like that, the Israelites, when they're talking about their God, normally just call him Elohim. Out of any other context, if an Israelite just came up and said, Elohim does this, you would know they were talking about their own personal God, whose proper name is Yahweh, but whom they normally just refer to as Elohim. But there are other Elohim, too, just like there are other moms, besides just my own. And so there are a class of grouping of people. And that group of people are these people, these powers that are outside our normal realm, but in the unseen realm. Basically, the first point I want to make today is that Elohim does not just mean God or unique qualities of him. It describes a class of being which are in the unseen realm, one of whom, and distinctly one of whom, is Yahweh. He is clearly distinct from all other Elohim, but he is one because his natural world is in the unseen realm. We don't normally see Yahweh with our own eyes. So that's one. Now the second point is that of all of the Elohim, at least some of them are on a divine council that God uses to run the world. The seen and unseen realm are governed, if you will, through the divine council, of which God is the one CEO of that council. So what are the functions of the divine council? Well, the first one we've just looked at is to make decisions about how to implement the will of Yahweh on earth. They don't decide God's will, but they decide how to implement that on the earth. They debate, they deliberate, and then they decide how it will be implemented. We saw that in 1 Kings 22, verses 19 through 22, and it also comes up in Daniel chapter 4, verse 7. And we're going to look at that just real quickly. Verse 17. The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, and the decision by the command of the holy ones, in order that the living will know that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdom of humankind, and to whomever he wills it, he gives it, and he even sets the humblest of men over it. I should have given more context for Daniel 7, but Daniel 4. But Daniel 4 is when Nebuchadnezzar is told he's going to go crazy for a while because of his hubris, because of his pride. God is going to bring him down, and he's going to eat like a cow from the grass of the field. He's going to go crazy. He's not going to be able to govern. He's just going to be like an animal for a while. And that decision is by the decree of the watchers, according to Daniel 4:17. Watchers is another term for these divine beings on the divine council. Also, holy ones is a term that comes up for members of the divine council. Kedoshim in Hebrew is a term for these decision makers in God's realm. But their decisions are also God's decisions. They are implementing God's will in certain ways, and this is how they've decided to do it, by making Nebuchadnezzar crazy, as we would call it. But you see, the Most High is sovereign. The existence of a divine council does not negate the sovereignty of God. His will is still supreme, but how to implement that will is given to the divine council. And God uses it that way. Now, watchers is a very important word when it comes to this. Doesn't come up often in the Old Testament, but it's still important. Think about how appropriate it would have been in Zechariah, because one of the functions of these divine councils, or at least some of the members of it, is to observe the goings-on of humanity and report back to Yahweh what they observe, to report their observations. And we saw this explicitly in Zechariah chapter 1 while we were looking through the minor prophets. In Zechariah chapter 1, verse 10, Zechariah is having a vision of men on horseback, and he's talking to one of them about what these four are. And the man who is talking to him says, the man standing among the myrtles replied, "Those are they whom Yahweh has sent to patrol the world." Context tells us that these four men on horseback are divine beings. They are angels. And they are there to go through the world and then report back to Yahweh what they saw. That's what Zechariah's vision is of, them coming back from their patrol and reporting that the world is at peace in Zechariah chapter 1. So observing what goes on amongst the world of man is one of the functions of these angels, and that's why one of the terms for them is watcher. First Enoch uses the term watcher as a routine word for these members of the divine council. That's why it's so important to key in on that, because it does come up in First Enoch when it's clearly talking about the same group of people. But patrolling isn't just what they do. They do observe, but sometimes they actually implement. They execute the decisions of Yahweh and the council on earth. We also saw that in 1 Kings 22, verses 19 through 22. The decision was made to send a lying spirit to the prophets of Ahab, and so they execute that decision. They go and are the lying spirit in the prophets' mouths. In Revelation, we see the same kind of thing where these divine beings execute God's decisions. In Revelation chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, we read, "Then in my vision I saw the Lamb," that's Yahweh, that's the Jesus, that's God. "I saw the Lamb break one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures shout in a voice like thunder, 'Come!' Immediately I saw a white horse appear, and its rider was holding a bow. He was given a victor's crown, and he went away to go from victory to victory." This is, of course, the first of the 4 riders of the apocalypse, as they are commonly referred to. But we have the Lamb, Yahweh, who breaks one of the 7 seals, which implements one of the other members of the divine council, one of the living creatures, to call another member on horseback to go and implement the decision on earth, to be victorious. Each one of these 4 members of the riders of the apocalypse. I think it may be no accident that there are 4 patrolling figures from Zechariah chapter 1, and there are 4 executioners, if you will, from Revelation chapter 6 on horseback, with some overlapping in the color of their horses. I think there's meant to be a connection here between these 2 groups of horsemen. And in any case, one is patrolling, one group is implementing. But I think we see that all through the divine council. They make decisions, and they implement those decisions on earth. And they deliver messages regarding the will of Yahweh to humans, to the people on earth. So they make the decisions, they execute the decisions, they watch what's going on, and they inform people on earth of what the decisions are, Yahweh's decisions. This is actually the role that we correctly call angel. The word angel means messenger. And so when God dispatches a member of his divine council to take a message to somebody on earth, that is literally an angel, there to make an announcement about Yahweh's decision. Of course, the most famous one is one we've been familiar with for the last few weeks in our Christmas season, and that is Gabriel. Gabriel, in Luke chapter 1, verses 26 through 29, in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town in Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin betrothed to a man named Joseph of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. He went in and said to her, "Rejoice, you who enjoy God's favor. The Lord is with you." She was deeply disturbed by these words and asked herself what this greeting could mean. But Gabriel, one of the few members of the divine council we actually have a name for, he comes down and delivers that message. And actually, they do other duties as assigned, because whatever God needs a divine being to do, it does. God is the ultimate power in the universe, and these angels are his way of executing that. So the question is why this matters. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to say why does this all matter anyway? What's the point, or what can I take away from this as a theological point that I can apply or think about or help me resolve my thinking? Dr. Heiser ends every chapter of Supernatural with his take on why this matters. And so here is mine on the function of the Elohim and the divine council. Why does it matter? Well, I think the divine council is one important piece in resolving the dichotomy, or even paradox, between God's sovereignty and our free will or personal responsibility. Why am I personally responsible for my actions to the point where I can be punished for them if God is ultimately the sovereign? If he's all-powerful, then why is my position one of taking personal responsibility? Well, I think the answer is that the same thing applies for us that applies to divine counsel. Delegated power. God has created you with the power to make decisions and to follow through with them. He delegated to the divine council authority, and he delegated power to them. And anytime I delegate power to someone else, I am giving up some of that of my own. I am withdrawing my own power and then giving it to you, so that you can take authority and execute within your power. And I believe that's the real key here. The divine council was invested with authority and power from God to make decisions and then implement those decisions. And they have free will to make decisions about how they're going to do it and then implement them. And I believe God has done the same thing with humanity. He's gone with us. The power structure that we see of the divine council is a reflection of the same power structure that he has given to humanity. And actually, people have failed to do that. People have failed to implement God's will appropriately. They have either simply by virtue of frailty failed to implement it properly because we are imperfect people, or intentionally failed to implement it properly by rebelling against God's design and deciding, I am not going to follow God's will here. I am not going to do what he said. I am going to do my own thing. That rebellion, I believe, is reflected both in our world, where we're kind of comfortable talking about our human rebellion against God's will, but also in the divine realm. These angelic beings, these Elohim, have free will, and they can choose not to do what God has asked them to do. And next week, we are going to begin to unwrap the parallels between divine rebellion and human rebellion next week. So that's where we're going. If you want to see any more details on these spiritual beings and get the Bible Project's take, I encourage you to go to their site. And here is a link to a particular series of videos on spiritual beings.